Welcome to the podcast, "'Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction About the Middle Ages." I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels. After a summer-long hiatus, we are finally back with a new episode. Last week, I posted an episode I scripted for the podcast Beef with Bridget Todd. It told of the conflict between Pope Boniface VIII and King Philip V of France that climaxed in the outrage of Agnani in the year 1302. That event marks the effective end to the papacy's claims to supremacy over Christendom's secular rulers. In this episode, we are going to see the first time that a Pope, Gregory VII, advanced such a claim and how it played out in his struggle with the German king and Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. Initially, I had planned only 3 episodes for our series on the medieval papacy, from Bishop of Rome to the Papal Monarchy. But after talking with Ellen, I decided that rushing over the Gregorian Reform and the investiture controversy would be a mistake.
Given how complicated, significant, and dramatic the Gregorian Reform and the investiture controversy were, they really deserve an episode or maybe even 2.
Yes, the voice you heard is my favorite co-host, my partner for life, and inspiration for all things medieval, my wife, Ellen.
I'm glad to be back, and yes, our summer vacation in China was wonderful. Richard posted pictures on Facebook if you're interested. I've been encouraging him to do an episode on Marco Polo, comparing medieval Europe and China.
I'd like to do that sometime in the future, but we'll just have to wait for that.
So back to the papacy.
An episode or 2 on the Gregorian Reform and the investiture controversy also gives me the opportunity to honor the passing last August of an old friend, Dr. Uta Renata Blumenthal, and to pay tribute to her scholarship. Dr. Blumenthal, a fellow of the Medieval Academy of America and a president of the American Catholic Historical Association, was arguably the foremost historian of the Gregorian Reform and the investiture controversy. She and I first met decades ago at Columbia University. She had just completed her dissertation on Pope Gregory VII, while I was beginning my graduate studies there. Her study of Gregory VII culminated in her masterwork, The Investiture Controversy, Church and Monarchy from the 9th to the 12th Century. Though published in 1988, this book remains an indispensable work for both students and teachers of medieval history. Uta taught for decades at the Catholic University of America,
where our friend and occasional co-host Jenny Paxton teaches.
Yes, and Jenny remembers her, as I do, as a warm and encouraging senior colleague. She was also a popular and enthusiastic teacher. The remaining episodes of this series are dedicated to her memory.
You've often said that the best conference papers are the ones that begin with a thesis statement, because otherwise listeners can get lost in a recitation of strange names and forgettable dates. Okay, what is your thesis statement? Okay,
here it goes. In the middle of the 11th century, a super pious German king, Henry III, in his capacity as Emperor of the Romans, Holy Roman Emperor, promoted a church reform movement to improve the morals and spiritual worthiness of the secular clergy of Western Christian, the non-monks. His main agent for reform was his hand-picked German pope, his cousin, Bruno, Bishop of Toul, who took the papal name Leo IX and reigned as pope from 1049 to 1054. Their main targets were the abuses of simony, Nicolaitism, fancy word for unchaste priests, and lay investiture. Historians term this movement the Gregorian Reform, named after its most zealous advocate, Gregory VII, who was pope from 1073 to 1085. Of the 3 abuses, the most contentious was lay investiture, the practice of a layman, usually a king, bestowing upon a newly elected bishop the symbols of his spiritual office. Gregory VII's prohibition and condemnation of this practice placed him at odds with Emperor Henry III's son and successor, the less pious King Henry IV. The result was the investiture controversy, which was a key factor in the transformation of the Roman Catholic Church into a unified, hierarchical, supranational institution with its own set of laws and courts, all under the sovereign authority of the Pope, who as vicar of Christ on earth and as St. Peter's successor, claimed the right to judge Christian secular rulers as well as the clergy.
In other words, what historians call the Papal Monarchy.
Yep.
I think it would be helpful to begin by examining what simony and lay investiture meant and why these practices and clerical marriage were viewed as abuses.
Okay, I think you're absolutely right. It's always good to begin with definitions. So here they go. Simony was and is the practice of selling and buying church offices and spiritual benefits such as sacraments and blessings. The name derives from Simon Magus, a Sarmatian magician and early convert to Christianity, who in chapter 8 of the Acts of the Apostles attempted to purchase from St. Peter the power of conferring the Holy Spirit through the laying on of hands.
But Peter said to him, as recorded in the Acts of the Apostles, "May your money perish with you, because you thought that you could buy the gift of God with money. You have no share or lot in this matter, for your heart is not upright before God." I think of simony as a medieval thing, but in preparation for this episode, I did a Google search and found a 2020 article by the Catholic News Agency reporting a homily by Pope Francis in which he condemned as simonists priests and bishops who use money to advance their careers.
Listeners of this podcast might remember that simony plays a key role in the movie Conclave,
Which I haven't seen.
It's a good movie. I recommend it.
I'll take your word for it. Anyway, simony was condemned by the church as an abuse for centuries before the 11th century, but wasn't clerical marriage common in the early church? I remember you saying in the first episode of this series that at least 5 popes during the 4th and 5th centuries were sons of priests. And wasn't the 6th century Pope Silverius the illegitimate son of Pope Hormidas?
Hormidas, yeah, supposedly he was. Celibacy was an ideal urged by the 4th century church fathers, especially Ambrose and Jerome. Some apparently took the ideal to an extreme through self-castration, following the lead of the priests of the cult of the Mother Earth goddess Sybil.
Ew.
Roman officials felt exactly the same way, and probably so do our listeners. And before you ask, there's actually some support for self-castration in the Bible. Jesus, in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19, verse 12, tells the Pharisees that there are 3 types of eunuchs: those who were born that way, those made so by others, and those who, and I quote, made themselves eunuchs because of the kingdom of heaven. And he didn't mean the movie.
Whatever you say, sweetheart.
The early church, however, discouraged a literal interpretation of this passage. The very first canon of the Council of Nicaea of 325 deals with this issue. It decrees that those who were made eunuchs by others, such as by barbarians or their masters, are permitted to be ordained to the priesthood if they are otherwise found worthy. However, those who have voluntarily self-castrated themselves are excluded from ordination and, if already ordained, are to be removed from the clergy. Most other Christian churches shared this interpretation. The doctrinally approved interpretation of this passage, that Jesus was referring to those who have resisted carnal temptation and who have chosen to live like eunuchs, is incorporated into the very text of the widely used New International Version of the Bible. However, one extreme Christian sect, the 18th century Russian Skopsy, required male believers to castrate themselves and females to mutilate their sexual organs, as both were signs of original sin. We can say it together. Ew. Okay, sorry about getting sidetracked. The point is that chastity and celibacy were recognized as Christian virtues, but so was faithful marriage, which was seen as God's gift to fallen man. That passage I quoted from Matthew follows upon Jesus' declaration about the indissolubility of marriage. Until the middle of the 11th century, canon law permitted priests to be married. In fact, one of the earliest collection of canons, the 4th century apostolic canons, decreed, and again I quote, "Let not a bishop, priest, or deacon put away his wife under pretense of religion, but if he put her away, let him be excommunicated, and if he persists, let him be deposed," end quote. Okay, getting back to the 11th century, in practice, clerical marriage may have been the rule rather than the exception when it came under attack by church reformers.
So what changed?
A couple of related things. One was the advent of a monastic reform movement in the 10th century.
You mean the Cluniac movement?
Yes. Most famously, the reform movement associated with the monastery of Cluny in Burgundy. But monastic reform was in the air in the late 10th and early 11th centuries. The monasteries of Lower Lorraine, now in northeastern France, but in the 11th century part of the German Empire, and the monasteries of northern Italy play a more direct role in our story.
So the ideal of clerical celibacy arose from church reformers' desire to remake the secular clergy along the lines of monastic sanctity.
Yeah. That was the moral purpose. The idea was that just as monks were married to their monasteries, priests were married to the church. But there was also a very practical reason to prohibit priests and bishops from marrying.
Let me guess, to eliminate the possibility or even probability that they would have sons who would inherit their offices along with the lands and revenues, especially the lands and revenues.
Yeah, that's really cynical of you. It's also really perceptive. This was a very real concern. The church, after all, held about a third of all the landed wealth in Western Europe in the 11th century.
And they didn't want to give it back to the descendants of the people who had donated it.
Yeah.
Clerical celibacy remains a core doctrine, even today. And it's one of the key differences between Protestant ministers and Catholic priests.
Yeah. It's ironic that the prohibition against clerical marriage was attacked during another church reform movement, the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. Martin Luther and other reformers rejected clerical celibacy as lacking a scriptural foundation.
Yeah. Didn't Luther marry a nun?
Is that terrible? Yes. He married Katharina von Bora. As he said at the time, he married her not for her physical beauty, but for her godliness. Marrying a nun was the ultimate in-your-face rejection of the Catholic Church's demand for clerical celibacy. Martin Luther substituted faithful marriage as a God-given institution and a God-given gift to fallen man for the Church's exaltation of celibacy as the highest expression of piety.
Don't Eastern Orthodox churches also permit clergy to marry?
True enough. In those churches, married men can be ordained as priests, although if the wife of a priest should die, that priest is not to remarry. Celibacy, however, is required of bishops. This difference in clerical discipline between the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches has its roots in the historical event known as the Great Schism, as we're going to see later in this episode.
Okay, but simony, the purchase of church offices, seems to be an even more obvious abuse.
Not really. It's true that simony was condemned by the early church, but the actual practice attacked by the Gregorian reformers as simony had not been previously understood to be simony.
I think you need to explain that.
The 11th century clergy and laity shared a gift-giving culture shaped by the ethos of reciprocity. Every gift looked for a return. If a king or count made a priest a bishop, or if he endowed him with a valuable benefice or made a monk an abbot, it was only proper that the grateful cleric should respond with a suitable gift. But the economic context of such a transaction was changing. The 11th century marks the beginning of what historians call the commercial revolution, the rise of a European commercial economy. As the historian Lester Little pointed out, the most ardent church reformers came from regions that were experiencing the greatest economic development, northern Italy and the lowlands. Some of the most ardent opponents of simony and clerical marriage were merchants and other laymen in northern Italian and Flemish cities.
Okay, I can understand why monks and reforming clergy were so concerned, but why townsmen?
Lester Little suggests that the commercial revolution increased spiritual anxiety. Those who dealt on a day-to-day basis with the accumulation of earthly goods recognized that the world was too much with them. They wanted priests and bishops who were purer in spirit and action than they were.
Which also explains why movements of apostolic poverty like Waldensians and the Franciscans began with merchants and the sons of merchants.
We can think of this as a paradigm shift. The traditional practice of bishops thanking the kings and princes who appointed them with valuable countergifts had been understood as a morally obligatory expression of gratitude and continued to be viewed that way, at least that's what the argument is, by kings and the medieval rural aristocracy. But to the reformers in the cities of medieval Flanders and Italy, it looked a hell of a lot like the buying and selling of these lucrative offices.
Hidden in that last sentence is an allusion to lay investiture.
Nice catch.
And when you speak of lay investiture, that means laymen, non-clergy, appointing bishops, abbots, and parish priests.
And that was, in fact, the underlying issue. But as this was a symbolic age, that concern was expressed symbolically. Lay investiture, as I said, was the practice of lay people investing churchmen, that is, handing over to churchmen physically the symbols of their spiritual offices and powers, and by implication, handing to them, endowing them with those offices themselves.
Okay.
The accepted practice in the early Middle Ages was for a powerful layperson, usually a king or emperor, to confer upon a newly elected bishop the symbols of his spiritual episcopal office.
So the physical symbol was a crozier, a really fancy shepherd's crook, symbolizing his pastoral duties, and a ring symbolizing his marriage to the church.
Yes. According to canon law, bishops were supposed to be elected by the clergy and approved by the laity in their diocese. In practice, early medieval kings, claiming to be God's vicars on earth, appointed bishops. This might be followed by a token election.
And that is how I was taught about the investiture controversy as an undergraduate. Technically, it may have focused on the ritual of investiture, the symbols of spiritual authority, but the underlying issue was lay control over the appointment of bishops and abbots, the first church-state conflict in the West.
I was with you until the very last sentence.
Oh, well.
It wasn't a church versus state controversy. It was a conflict over who had ultimate authority within the church. The underlying issue was who was God's vicar on earth. Kings claimed that God had entrusted them with the care and welfare of the churches within their kingdom. And the bishops were, in a sense, their spiritual vassals.
And of course, the bishops in particular possessed authority over extensive territories and lands.
And that also meant that bishops exercised lordship over numerous military tenants. Because they were the educated, literate elite, the clergy served as royal administrators. This was especially true for bishops, many of whom had acquired administrative experience as royal chaplains. Throughout Christendom, bishops exercised temporal as well as spiritual authority. The investiture ceremony of a bishop in medieval Germany involved not only his spiritualia, his crozier and ring, but also his regalia, a scepter symbolizing the delegated royal authority he would now possess over his cathedral city. The reformers' attack on lay investiture was a repudiation of the claim of kings to have authority over bishops and the clergy of their realms. And this, as my late mentor, Warren Hollister, observed, quote, was a challenge to the social order and a threat to the authority of every ruler in Western Christendom, end quote.
So, we can get to the story.
Yes, finally. It begins with King Henry III of Germany. In 1046, 7 years after the death of his father, the Emperor Conrad II, King Henry III crossed the Alps into Italy to be consecrated Roman Emperor by the Pope and to promote reform in the Italian Church.
7 years? What was he waiting for?
It wasn't unusual. It took several years for an elected king of Germany to impose his rule over the dukes, most of whom were always pretty insubordinate. And it wasn't until 1046 that Henry III felt sufficiently secure to cross into Italy for his coronation as Roman Emperor.
You said that King Henry III was known as pious, but how pious was he?
Sounds like a joke. Okay. Now, Uta Renata Blumenthal characterized Henry III, I think, really well. Quote, Henry III symbolizes theocratic rule, the guidance of church and state as a single entity by the divinely elected, anointed emperor." End quote. Some historians go even further and characterize Henry III's conception of kingship as Christo-mimetic. That is, he took Christ for his model of kingship. Henry III embraced the Christian peace movement that had begun in France. At the Council of Constance in 1043, he preached a sermon calling for that peace. Dressed in sackcloth, Henry publicly forgave those who had committed offenses against him and urged his subjects to do the same. He repeated that gesture in the following year and then again in 1047.
Christo-mimetic. I know that the Carolingian and Salian emperors were theocratic, but this sounds like something different. Where did he get this idea from?
The impetus may have been the death of his mother, Gisela of Swabia. By all accounts, she was a highly devout and learned woman who, along with Bishop Bruno of Augsburg, oversaw his education. His piety was greatly shaped by the monastic reform movements emanating from Cluny and especially from the region of Lorraine. Many of those who served in his chapel and whom he elevated into the ranks of the German episcopacy were reformers.
So the road to a bishopric ran through the royal chapel?
It did. In this, Henry III was traditional. An ambitious German cleric in the 10th and 11th centuries would do well to seek a position in the king's court. Obtaining one was often the result of family connections. But once he had a place, the royal chaplain had to distinguish himself through administrative as well as religious service to the throne. Henry III promoted chaplains whom he saw as both pious and competent.
So did he accept the traditional practice of accepting gifts from the bishops he appointed?
He didn't, because he regarded that as a sin of simony.
But he obviously had no reservations about filling bishoprics with clerics of his choice. Did he view lay investiture as an abuse?
On the contrary, his theocratic conception of kingship not only justified, but mandated lay investiture. Kings were consecrated and anointed to rule by bishops, just as David had been anointed by Samuel. Kings reign by grace of God, and according to the Bible, this is Paul to the Romans, chapter 13, verses 1 to 4. In this passage, kings are said to be God's swords of justice on earth. In Byzantium, this conception of kingship developed into the idea that the emperor was the living icon of Christ, possessed with the earthly majesty of God's divine majesty. It didn't quite get that extreme in the West, but the Frankish king and Emperor Charlemagne and his successors promoted a theocratic conception of kingship, and this shaped how Henry III understood his role vis-a-vis the church. He viewed himself as an anointed ruler endowed with spiritual as well as secular authority. God had entrusted the welfare of the church to him. This entailed choosing the right men to fill vacant episcopal sees and investing them with the symbols of their office.
As we've seen, croziers symbolizing their role as shepherd and rings symbolizing their marriage to their see.
You know, Henry III, and I just learned this, was the first king to invest bishops with rings.
Really?
Yeah, I was surprised to find that out. I think it has something to do with discouraging the holding of multiple sees.
Oh, yeah, the abuse of pluralism.
Yeah, sort of like episcopal bigamy. Unsurprisingly, pluralism was common and wasn't really stamped out until the Council of Trent in the 16th century. But back to Henry III. After he invested a new bishop with his spiritualia, Henry III would then have him swear fidelity to him. Even more than his predecessors, Henry entrusted his bishops with counties and relied upon them as royal administrators.
So, Henry III crossed the Alps and arrived at Rome in 1046 to be consecrated Roman emperor by the Pope. How is this different from what his father or any of the previous German kings had done?
What was different was that he discovered upon arriving in Rome that the papacy was in complete disarray.
Wait a minute. If there's anything I've learned in this series of is that the papacy was always in disarray.
Yeah, but here it was particularly so.
Okay.
There were 3 popes, not one, but 3. Now, that might be good for a trinity, but it's not good for the papacy.
Okay.
The 3 popes were Benedict IX, Sylvester III, and Gregory VI. Of these, Pope Benedict IX had by far the longest tenure. He was a member of the Tusculum family that at that time ruled Rome and was the nephew of his predecessor. Elected in 1032 while still in his 20s, he had the reputation for violence and sexual laxity.
Wait a minute. He would have fit in nicely with the bad popes of the 10th century from our last episode, but I thought the Emperor Otto I and its successors had broken the power of the local Roman aristocracy over the papacy.
Only temporarily, and they did it only when they turned their attention to Italy. And that's usually when they decided it was time to make the long trek across the Alps to Rome to get consecrated as emperor. In the absence of the German king, the great families of Rome and the papal states continued to dominate the papacy. Benedict IX had pursued a policy of independence from German kings, which was safe as long as the German king remained in Germany.
So, well.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, in September of 1044, a civil war broke out in Rome against the rule of the Tusculan family. Contemporary sources assert that the people of Rome rose up in disgust against the young pope's notoriously licentious lifestyle and drove him from the city.
That would have been nice.
But I suspect that it had as much, if not more, to do with internal Roman politics. The rival Crescentian family had their local bishop, John of Sabina, installed as pope on the 20th January 1045. He took the papal name Sylvester III. Benedict IX promptly excommunicated him. When Benedict and his supporters recaptured Rome in March, Sylvester III fled back to the safety of Sabina, where he continued to insist that he was pope.
Okay. Who's behind door number 3?
I was just getting to that. The restored Benedict IX was not a happy man.
No.
He had grown increasingly disenchanted with being pope.
Okay.
One couldn't blame him, given the continued hostility of a large segment of the Roman laity. Some sources also say that he wanted to get married. In any case, Benedict IX agreed to resign the papacy in favor of his godfather, John Gratian, archpriest of St. John at the Latin Gate, who took the papal name Gregory VI. Now, Gregory VI was an extremely pious man who would have made a very good pope, except for one small problem. In order to compensate Benedict and his family for the loss of the revenues that accrued from the papacy, he paid Benedict IX a huge sum of money.
Let me guess. Simony.
That's exactly the problem. And that's how his contemporaries saw it. Despite that, Gregory VI had the reputation of being a reformer. 2 of the leading figures of the Gregorian Reform movement, Peter Damian and Hildebrand, the future Pope Gregory VII, were members of his household. Meanwhile, Benedict IX had seller's remorse and claimed back the papacy.
So, which of the 3, if any, was the true pope?
That's a really good question. If you take a look at the textbooks, medieval surveys of the medieval church, you'll find the anti-popes always written in italics and the true popes just written as true popes. The problem is, in these lists, all 3 of these guys are designated as popes rather than anti-popes.
Okay.
Now, if the church can't figure out which of the 3 was the one, don't expect me to be able to.
Or Henry III.
Or
right?
Henry III.
Okay.
As King of Germany, Henry regarded the Bishop of Rome to be as much his spiritual vassal as any German bishop. He saw it as his duty to heal this breach in the unity of the church. Consequently, he summoned all 3 popes to attend a church synod at Sutri on December the 20th, 1046, to resolve the problem. Gregory VI was the only pope to appear. The council formally deposed him and deposed Sylvester III, the former for the crime of simony and the latter because of his irregular election.
So, Benedict IX is the last pope left standing?
Briefly.
Okay.
3 days later, Benedict IX was also deposed by a synod in Rome. King Henry III then nominated and the council elected as pope a German, Sugia of Bamberg, a trusted royal chaplain who just happened to be with Henry as he went to Rome.
Okay.
And he took the papal name Clement II and anointed Henry as Emperor of the Romans. Pope Clement II spent most of his short pontificate traveling in the entourage of King, now Emperor Henry III, first within Italy, where he placed the city of Benevento near Naples under interdict for refusing to open its gate to the German king, and then back to Germany. Meanwhile, Pope Gregory VI was exiled to Germany and was held in custody in Cologne, where he was accompanied by his chaplain, Hildebrand.
The Hildebrand, the future Gregory VII?
Yes.
Okay.
And it's ironic that the great reformer took as his papal name Gregory, which recalled not only Gregory I, Gregory the Great, but more immediately the Simonist Gregory VI.
Okay, what happened to the other two?
Sylvester III returned to being Bishop of Sabina.
Good career move.
Benedict IX, however, attempted a comeback in 1047 when Clement II died, probably of lead poisoning.
What?
Yeah, that's what experts who examined the body in 1942 discovered. And he died on his journey back to Rome from Germany. With the support of the local aristocracy, Benedict IX temporarily regained control of Rome, but was expelled in the following year by Count Boniface of Tuscany on orders from King, now Emperor, Henry III. Benedict IX then retired to his Tusculan family lands and continued to insist that he was pope for the rest of his life. King Henry III chose another member of his entourage, Papal, the Bishop of Brixen, to succeed Clement II as pope. But Papal, who took the papal name Damasus II, promptly died upon arriving in Rome.
Don't tell me he was poisoned too.
No, he probably died of malaria.
Okay.
Undeterred by the rapid deaths in succession of two German pontiffs, maybe God was... No, never mind. Henry III chose a third German to be pope. This was his kinsman Bruno, Bishop of Toul, now in northeastern France, but which in the 11th century belonged to the Holy Roman Empire. Bruno chose the papal name Leo IX.
This is beginning to sound like a Monty Python.
Yes. Henry III's third German bishop proved the charm. Bruno was the son of a count in Alsace and a cousin of the king. His career followed the traditional course for German bishops of the early 11th century. He was dedicated to the church at an early age and became a canon at the Cathedral of Toul. In that capacity, he led the bishop's troops in an Italian campaign under his kinsman, King Conrad II, in 1026, and Conrad II rewarded him by naming him Bishop of Toul when the see fell vacant a year later.
Wait a minute. So as a canon, a priest to the cathedral, he led an episcopal army? I thought he was a pious reformer. I mean, wasn't this the heyday of the peace movement? Didn't canon law prohibit priests from shedding blood? And weren't clergy supposed to be protected non-combatants?
Right on all counts. But 10th and 11th century German bishops were the secular authorities over their cathedral cities and ruled with delegated royal powers. German bishoprics and abbeys possessed substantial land endowments, as we've seen, and had large numbers of troops at their disposal. When it came to military assistance, kings did not distinguish between them and secular magnates. A late 10th century document lists the military contingents to be sent to Emperor Otto II for his campaign in southern Italy. In this list, we find 4 archbishops and 14 bishops who in total were expected to provide over 1,000 armored horsemen. These episcopal contingents were sometimes led personally by the bishop. In the 30 years between 880 and 910, at least 7 German bishops died in battle, either against the Vikings or the Magyars.
Okay, this makes sense. This is like Archbishop Turpin in the Song of Roland. It wasn't just fiction.
The ideal warrior bishop of the late 11th century, a prelate equally adept with wielding a crosier and a lance. I love the reaction of the French knights in the poem when the archbishop on his charger strikes a Muslim emir with such force that he shatters his shield and, quote, cuts the body in halves one side to the other and hurls him down dead in an empty spot. The French say, that was a valiant stroke. In the archbishop's hands, the crosier is quite safe, end quote.
Dear God.
Yes, you are right about canon law. and there were reformers who greatly disapproved of clergy bearing arms. But as we'll see in a bit, Pope Leo IX was not among them. Surrounded by enemies and fractured internally by rivalries and feuds among the great noble families, Germany in the early Middle Ages was an extremely violent region. As historian Graham Loud observed, quote, "The military involvement of the German episcopate was unusual within the medieval church as a whole. Elsewhere in Christian and warlike bishops were the exception. In Germany, they were more or less the rule," end quote.
Okay, so Bruno of Toul was a traditionalist when it came to taking arms to defend their sees or in response to a summons from the king. I get that. And Henry III would have approved. But if he chose Bruno to be pope, Bruno must have had the reputation of being a reformer as a bishop, right?
He did.
Okay.
Bruno was a moving force in the ecclesiastical reform movement then spreading throughout Lower Lorraine. He reformed the canons of Cathedral Chapter of Toul, and he used the Benedictine rule as his guide for that, and in cooperation with the abbots, emphasized the adherence to that rule in the monasteries of Montmoutier and Saint-Dié. Among the monks in Montmoutier at that time was Humbert of Silva Candida, who would become a leading firebrand of the reform movement.
Wait a minute. That Humbert of Silva Candida?
Humbert.
He was a firebrand, all right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bruno, before and after he became pope, emphasized the necessity of strict moral standards for both secular clergy as well as monks. He specifically targeted the abuses of simony and clerical marriage. He and his kinsman, King Henry III, were on the same page about that.
Okay, so anything that enriched a family below the level of a king or emperor was sinful, but anything that enhanced the power of a king or emperor was good. So I gather that he didn't view lay investiture as an abuse quite so much.
I think, I know what you're saying, but in the case of King Henry III, I think that he was honestly pious. I think he really was. And he didn't see lay investiture at all as being an abuse. On his part, Bishop Bruno believed that it was proper to give a king the fealty and homage he deserved and to accept from him the symbols of his office. He did persuade Henry III to allow one bishop, Halenard, to assume the see of Leon despite Halenard's principled refusal to do homage and fealty to Henry III. But Halenard was an exceptional case, and there's no evidence that Bruno himself refused to swear fealty, either when he became a bishop or when he became pope. Bruno did care about propriety and adherence to canon law. When Henry III nominated him to be pope, he accepted on condition that his election be ratified by the Roman clergy and the people of Rome as required by canon law.
Wow.
He traveled to Rome in the garb of a pilgrim and was consecrated pope on the 12th of February, 1049, choosing the name Leo, probably to recall Pope Leo I, Leo the Great. Now, the pontificate of Pope Leo IX, which was from 1049 to 1054, proved to be a watershed in the history of the papacy. As Pope, Leo IX initiated what was to be called the Gregorian Reform.
So how did Gregory VII get credit for the reform?
Yeah, I really don't know. What I could say is that Pope Leo IX's pontificate was a pivotal moment in the growth of papal authority and bureaucracy. But it's Gregory VII who, in the history books, gets remembered as being the great reformer. Although, Leo did become a saint much quicker than Gregory VII became a saint.
Seems almost fair.
Among the things that distinguished Leo IX from his predecessors was his frequent travels outside of Rome. He spent much of his pontificate going throughout Germany and Italy, which brought the presence of the papacy immediately to these various widespread dioceses.
Do we know what took place at these visits and councils?
The first ones announced his war on simony. We have a detailed account of one of those councils. Immediately following his consecration as pope, Leo IX left Rome to return to his old diocese of Toul. He took the opportunity to attend the translation of the bones of St. Remigius to a new cathedral in Reims on the 1st of October in 1049. Leo IX was to consecrate the newly built church of the monastery of St. Remigius and to transfer the bones of that saint to his tomb in the new cathedral. He also took the opportunity to summon the bishops of France to a council that was to commence immediately after the translation.
Okay, Reims was where French kings were consecrated and crowned, so I assume Leo did this to express his primacy over the French bishops.
Probably. But, in fact, only 20, less than half, of the French bishops responded because King Henry I of France, fearing of being condemned by the papacy for simony and perhaps hostile to a prelate whom he viewed as a servant of the German king, had ordered his bishops to accompany him on a military campaign.
And given a choice between obeying a king or a pope, they went with the king. Okay.
Well, the king was much closer, and the king had appointed them.
And he had more of an army.
Yep.
Okay.
After the formal procession, Leo placed the bones of the saint on the altar rather than what he was supposed to do, which was inter them in the tomb. The saint himself was to preside over the council.
Subtle.
Leo's chancellor, the Cardinal Deacon Peter, announced that the synod was to begin and asked who among the bishops and abbots present had purchased their offices.
Uh-oh.
A tumult ensued, with the Archbishop of Reims receiving permission to delay his answer. He was actually granted a private audience in Rome in the following April. The papal chancellor pressed the matter over the next few days. The proceedings ended up by focusing on one single representative simonist, the Bishop of Langres. He was to be defended by two archbishops. One of them, however, found himself incapable of speech.
Aha.
The other ended up by admitting his client's guilt.
Oh, great.
Judgment was deferred to the following day, and the Bishop of Langres took off in the middle of the night. He was excommunicated in absentia. The Pope led the synod singing Sancte Remigi, then received confessions from the other bishops. Some he removed, but most he forgave, giving them each a new crozier. The council ended with Pope Leo IX carrying the body of the saint to the crypt.
Wow, now that was a powerful pope.
Certainly more powerful than any pope since Pope Nicholas I in the middle of the 9th century. Leo IX clearly asserted the primacy of Rome over the episcopate, but his pontificate was a mixed bag. On the one hand, he strengthened the papacy as an institution, and he helped centralize the Western Church. Leo IX promoted an exalted conception of the papacy as the primate of the one holy apostolic church and as God's vicar on earth. In this, he was aided by an intellectual revival in the 11th century. The Reformed papacy's most potent weapons in promoting papal supremacy proved to be the revival of law and the transformation of the Roman Curia from an organ of local government and liturgical service into the central offices of an international church. From Leo's pontificate on, we see the growth of the cardinals as a force in papal government.
Well, there always were cardinals, right? And in our earlier episodes, Rome was surrounded by 7 pocket-sized suburban dioceses, each had its own bishop, priests, and deacons. Originally, popes used them to help them in their liturgical duties, and gradually they became the heads of the offices of the papal curia, that is, the pope's court in Rome.
Yeah, they were. And Leo IX created around him a circle of assistants and helpers who served him as advisors. And you know who was at the very center of that? These cardinals.
Okay, makes sense.
Leo IX's reliance on his cardinals as an advisory senate was the embryo of the future College of Cardinals. Leo's helpers served him mainly as legates, that's representatives and ambassadors. Not until Gregory VII, however, was the policy of using permanent standing legates adopted.
Like our anti-hero, Humbert of Sol the Candidate.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
The cardinals numbered 7 bishops, 28 priests, 18 deacons, and possibly as many as 21 subdeacons.
That's in Leo's lifetime, right?
Yes.
Okay.
They were the clergy of the Lateran Cathedral of Rome. The most important of Leo's IX's advisors were a monk from Leo's native Lorraine, Humbert of Silva Candida.
Oh, well.
Yeah, whom he made cardinal bishop. Peter Damian, a monk and archdeacon from Ravenna, and Hildebrand, a Roman monk who had been an important advisor to Pope Gregory VI.
It's interesting that he preferred monks over bishops.
Not really surprising. As I said, the goal of the Gregorian Reform was, at least initially, to reform the secular clergy along the lines of Benedictine monasticism.
And all of these men had established reputations as church reformers.
They had. Humbert, the most extreme and intemperate of the reformers, was an unforgiving opponent of simony, Nicolaitanism, and lay investiture. He regarded sacraments administered by Simonist bishops as being invalid.
Wait a minute. That is a heresy that I thought was condemned during the Roman Empire's persecutions.
Yeah, it is a Donatist heresy.
Yes, I mean, wait a minute, guys.
I know. And Peter Damian actually pointed that out to him. It didn't make much of a difference.
And they didn't do anything. Okay.
No. Humbert argued for the clergy's independence from the laity and regarded it as sinful to allow a layman to invest a bishop or an abbot with his holy office. Arguably, Humbert was the individual most responsible for creating the investiture controversy. A scholar, Humbert based his conception of papal supremacy on two forged documents, the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals and the Donation of Constantine.
In other words,
he didn't know
that he was a pseudo-scholar.
Oh, no.
Okay, never mind.
You know, it wasn't discovered that these were forgeries until the Renaissance. So, anyway, Humbert served Leo in the Secretariat of the Papacy, and as we'll see, acted as Leo's legate to Constantinople in 1054, where his blunt manner helped precipitate the Great Schism when he excommunicated the Patriarch.
Oh, God.
Peter Damian's chief concern was the purification of the Church. He was particularly opposed to simony and Nicolaitism, although he did not reject the validity of a Simonist ordination, as did Humbert, for the reasons that you gave. There is a revealing story about Peter that provides insight into his conception of simony. While he was a papal legate looking into complaints by the townspeople of Milan against their sinful bishop, he was offered a gift of silver by an abbot. He rejected the gift as improper, but the abbot responded that he had sought nothing in return. Peter still resisted, saying that clerics need not exchange gifts after the manner of laymen. Finally, the abbot prevailed by telling Peter to give the silver to a new eremitical establishment. Peter regretted his acceptance. He experienced dizziness when he tried to say the Psalms and suffered a loss of intestinal fortitude, literally, as he felt his insides squirming with vermin. So what did Peter do? He returned the gift.
And the hermits went without.
As I said, the new view of simony in the 11th century defined a gift like this as a commercial transaction, rejecting the idea that it was merely an innocent gift expressing love and gratitude.
Of course, they didn't ask why an abbot would have that much silver in his personal capacity to begin with, but never mind.
God, how are you so cynical? But anyway.
I'm not cynical, I'm a lawyer.
Oh, you're right.
Okay, they overlap.
They do. Like Humbert, Peter Damian supported papal supremacy and saw the papacy as being the font that would wash clean the entire church. Peter Damian, however, was not as extreme as Humbert.
But then again, who was?
He accepted the practice of lay investiture and saw pious laymen as allies in the war against sin, believing that the natural condition between church and state was cooperation. He took the position that ordinations were valid even if simoniacal.
Well, they sort of have to be because the priest who baptizes your kid is a conduit of God's grace. It's not because of personal merit of the priest. I mean, that had already been established for several hundred years.
And the alternative was complete and utter ecclesiastical chaos.
Yes.
Okay, so now we get to Hildebrand.
Okay.
Hildebrand, the later Pope Gregory VII. And Hildebrand proved to be the most important reformer to emerge from Leo IX's curia. Born around the year 1020 of humble parentage in Tuscany, Hildebrand was raised in the Lateran palace as an oblate.
That's a child who's given to become a monk.
To become a monk. He served as a chaplain to the unfortunate reformer, Pope Gregory VI, and accompanied him in exile to Cologne in 1046 when King Henry III deposed him for simony. Upon his patron's death, Hildebrand entered a Cluniac monastery. He returned to Rome in the entourage of Pope Leo IX, who ordained him as a subdeacon and made him treasurer of the Roman Church and prior of St. Paul's Monastery. Although Hildebrand followed Peter Damian on the validity of simoniacal orders, he joined with Humbert on the need for the clergy to be independent from lay control, including lay investiture.
Wait a minute. You said that Leo's pontificate was a mixed bag. So far, it sounds like very positive. He was a powerful pope who reorganized the papal curia, effectively asserted primacy over bishops, even deposing those guilty of simony. What's not to like?
Leo IX was less successful in his political dealings.
Okay.
As pope, Leo was the secular ruler of the papal states.
Right. The conglomeration of territories under direct papal sovereignty in the Middle Ages, stretching across central Italy from Rome in the southwest to Bologna and Ravenna in the northeast.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we went over the creation of these when we talked about
we don't need to do it again. Yeah.
Among Leo IX's most pressing political concerns as ruler of these Italian states, papal states, was the growing power of the Normans in southern Italy and Sicily. Southern Italy in 1049 was marked by divided lordship. In the early 11th century, the Byzantines claimed all of Italy and Sicily as part of their empire. But it is one thing to claim rule and quite another thing to actually possess it. In the early 11th century, Sicily was in the hands of Arabs. Amalfi and Naples were independent cities. Salerno, Capua, and Benevento were centers of Lombard principalities. In 1016, when according to legend, Norman pilgrims returning from Jerusalem landed in southern Italy, they discovered a political landscape that cried out for mercenaries.
Let me guess. They sent the word back to Normandy and invited their relatives and friends to join the feast.
Yeah, they did. The most successful of these adventurers were the sons of a minor Norman nobleman, Tancred of Hauteville, and the most successful of the brothers who came was Humphrey of Hauteville and his younger brother, Robert Guiscard. By the pontificate of Leo IX, the Normans had conquered most of southern Italy and parts of Sicily. Pope Leo IX saw these aggressive Norman adventurers as a possible threat to the papal states.
No duh.
The threat became immediate in 1051 when the citizens of the Lombard city of Benevento, which is about 60 miles northeast of Naples, turned to the Pope for protection against the Normans. Pope Leo IX responded by asking for military support from the Emperor Henry III and from the Byzantines, and by raising a coalition of Lombard princes to end the threat. In 1053, the Pope led a force raised from the Papal States and the Lombards of southern Italy against the Normans.
I know I shouldn't be surprised, but really?
No, you shouldn't be surprised. Remember, as a young canon of the Cathedral of Toul, Leo, then known as Bruno, had led the troops that the bishop owed to King Conrad II on Conrad's campaign in Lombardy. In a sense, in 1053, Leo was reliving the glories of his youth.
Oh dear, you can't. Okay, so he led the army. What happened?
Nothing good, at least nothing good from Leo's perspective. The Pope had been banking upon substantial support from Henry III and from the Byzantines, but King Henry III only gave him 700 Swabian foot soldiers.
I thought Henry III was the Pope's protector and the muscle behind the reform movement.
He was, but this expedition had nothing to do with advancing church reform.
It only was keeping the church... Never mind.
The Pope's request for military support was opposed by Henry III's imperial chancellor, Gebhard Bishop of Eichstätt, on the grounds that the German king had more pressing military needs. The German king at that point was fighting an on and off war against the Hungarians while simultaneously dealing with several internal revolts. Henry III might also have been reluctant to get too involved in the tangled and violent political situation in southern Italy. A few years earlier, he had actually approved Humphrey of Hauteville's conquest of the Principality of Benevento.
Huh?
Yeah, it was easily done, as this region was claimed by the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople, and Henry III said, "It's none of my business."
So, did the Byzantines help?
A Byzantine army did advance north, while Leo's troops marched south. It was a great strategic plan. They were to catch the Norman army in a pincer movement. But the Normans moved quickly to intercept the papal army before it could link up. The papal army, although larger in numbers, was totally destroyed at Civitate. Leo IX was captured and held prisoner in the city of Benevento.
What? He was held prisoner? Did Henry III at least send troops to rescue him?
He was, and Henry III didn't.
Huh?
As I said, Henry in 1053 and in 1054 had several military challenges in Germany to deal with. He knew that Leo was in no danger. Humphrey of Hauteville and his brothers craved legitimacy for their conquests, and it was legitimacy that the Pope could give them. Leo was treated more like an honored guest than a captive. He was even permitted to maintain contact with the outside world. It was while he was in captivity that Leo IX dispatched a mission to Constantinople to restore frayed relations with the Eastern Emperor and to remind the Patriarch of Constantinople of Rome's primacy.
Bet that went over big.
After a captivity of 9 months, Leo IX fell ill. The Normans allowed him to return to Rome on the 12th of March in 1054, where he died a month later.
Oh, well, I can sort of see why it's remembered as Gregorian Reform and people would just prefer to forget the sad ending of his career. Okay.
Actually, as we're going to see, Gregory VII had even a sadder end.
And Pope Leo IX's dealings with Byzantium were even more disastrous because of the obnoxious Humbert of Silva Candida.
Your favorite guy, right?
Oh, God. I mean, Leo IX reviewed himself as primate of one universal apostolic Christian church, and that wouldn't have gone over well anyway with the Patriarch of Constantinople or his patron, the Byzantine Emperor Constantine IX Monomarchus.
Absolutely. Though the mission that Leo IX dispatched to Constantinople had as much to do with the political situation in southern Italy as with matters of ecclesiastical primacy and church doctrine. Relations between the papacy and the Byzantine court, as I said, had frayed. The emperor regarded southern Italy and Sicily as parts of the Byzantine Empire, even if they were temporarily, quote, temporarily, held by Normans, Arabs, and Lombards. Pope Leo IX's attempt to deal with the Normans, his holding of a council in Byzantine territory, and his naming of Humbert of Silva Candida as Archbishop of Sicily created suspicion and hostility in Byzantium, where he was considered to be meddling with what properly belonged to the empire and to the Patriarch.
Well, yeah.
The Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius, responded by shutting down the Latin churches in Byzantium and attacking Western religious practices, notably the use of unleavened bread for the Eucharist and the appearance of the term filioque in the Latin Mass. Okay, Ellen, why don't you explain the filioque controversy?
Okay. Filioque is a dispute over the nature of the Holy Trinity. Latin versions of the Nicene Creed have the Holy Spirit proceeding from the Father and the Son, filioque. Greek versions have the Holy Spirit proceeding only from the Father. So filioque is clearly an addition to the original creed, and it's no longer a big deal. Both Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis omitted filioque when the former recited the creed with the ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, and the later in a visit to Greece. But it was a big deal in 1054.
Pope Leo IX sent a delegation to Constantinople to obtain the reopening of the Latin churches. Emperor Constantine IX welcomed him as he saw this as an opportunity to form an alliance with the Pope against the Normans. he didn't quite know that Leo was in no position to do an alliance at this point.
Against anybody.
Yeah. But the mission was doomed from the start because the man whom the Pope chose to represent him.
Yeah, Leo IX couldn't have made a worse choice.
Leo IX's naming of Humbert as Archbishop of Sicily, which the Byzantines claimed as their territory, was one of the causes of Byzantine hostility. Humbert himself was angry that he had to give up the title and office because of Byzantine pushback.
Figures. All that aside, Humbert lacked the qualities needed in an ambassador or negotiator. Cantankerous, self-righteous, stubborn to the point of being unyielding. He was a fervent and effective advocate of church reform, but the worst possible choice to lead a delegation if the goal was reconciliation.
Yeah.
Humbert carried a conciliatory papal letter to the emperor, which played down Henry III's imperial claims, itself a source of conflict, and an inflammatory reproach against the patriarch. This letter described Rome as a suffering, patient, persecuted mother, and the Eastern Church is lost, quote, in pleasure and lasciviousness, in the dissipation of a long leisure, refusing to take part in the fight waged on her behalf by the pious mother, repaying her efforts by mocking her mother's old age and her body worn out by long labors, close quote. The patriarch was not impressed, and he responded with similar invective. Humbert did the same. He stormed into Hagia Sophia, marched up to the altar, and placed on it in full view of the congregation a bull, excommunicating the patriarch and his followers. And so, of course, the patriarch excommunicated the entire papal legation.
Yes, all that happened on the 16th of July, 1054, and that date is used to mark the beginning of the Great Schism between the Eastern and Western churches.
Which only lasted for 1,000 years. Wait a minute, though. July 16th? I thought you said Pope Leo IX died in April.
Yeah, he did. He died on the 19th of April. This all happened 3 months after his death. It took that long for the news to get to Constantinople. In fact, when Humbert excommunicated the patriarch, the papal see lay vacant. A new pope wasn't consecrated for almost a year.
So, how did Humbert have the power to excommunicate anybody?
It's questionable, but that didn't really matter.
You mean true but irrelevant?
Yeah.
Okay.
The result was the Great Schism, which, as you said, persists down to today. And because the schism took place at the beginning of the Gregorian Reform, the attack on clerical marriage as a church abuse took root in the West, but not in the East.
It's sad. Pope Leo IX seems to have died as a defeated man even before Humbert really blew it. How did that affect the reform movement and the papacy's claims to primacy, at least in the West?
Initially, not at all. In Mainz, after protracted discussions with representatives from the Roman See, and these representatives were led by Hildebrand, Henry III chose his fourth and final German pope, and that was Gebhard, Bishop of Eichstätt, who took the papal name Victor II.
You mean the imperial chancellor who blocked military aid to Leo IX?
That's the guy.
Okay.
He may not have been the preferred choice of the Roman delegation, and I know he wasn't, but he was precisely the man that Henry III needed at that time on the papal throne. Gebhard was a first-rate administrator, talented negotiator, and completely loyal to Henry III. The political situation in northern Italy had become problematic. Favorite historians' word, problematic. One of Henry's German rivals, Duke Godfrey of Lorraine, had married the widow of Count Boniface of Tuscany. The union of the Duchy of Lorraine and the County of Tuscany represented a threat to imperial control. Henry needed a politically astute and loyal pope. Gebhard was the man.
Was church reform lost in with the politics?
Gebhard was committed to reform. If he wasn't, the pious Henry would never have appointed him. In fact, one of Victor II's first acts as pope was to preside alongside the emperor at a great synod in Florence, at which simony and clerical unchastity were once again pronounced as being sinful.
Did Henry III go to Italy to preside over that synod?
No, he went to Italy at the head of an army to deal with the threat represented by Duke Godfrey.
Okay.
Godfrey prudently fled, leaving behind his wife and stepdaughter Matilda.
Tell me those are two different people.
Yeah, they
okay.
are, who will play a critical role in our story, and they were left in the care of the papacy. To strengthen Victor II's political position, he made the Pope Duke of Spoleto and Count of Fermo.
And how did that go over with the Normans?
Not well. Like his predecessor had done, Victor II now turned to Emperor Henry III for military support against the Normans.
Oh boy. Did he get it?
Nope. And that was largely because Henry III suddenly died, leaving behind a young widow and a 5-year-old son. Probably Victor II's greatest political coup was persuading the German dukes and bishops to elect the kid as king and to allow the royal widow, Agnes, to serve as regent during the minority of her son, who is now King Henry IV.
Which I assume means that they could do whatever they wanted during the regency. So, the King of Germany is a child, and how did that affect the papacy?
It created enormous problems for the Reformed papacy.
Well, yeah.
When Victor II died in 1057, the Reformed party quickly named one of their own, Frederick of Lorraine, who was abbot of Monte Cassino and the brother of the powerful Duke Godfrey of Lorraine, and he took the name Pope Stephen IX.
The local Roman aristocracy must have been chafing for the last decade over having bishops of Rome who were not Roman and had no connection with them. Must have been upset. I mean, after all, they thought of it as their see.
They were upset. And when Stephen IX died after a brief 7-month pontificate, the Roman aristocracy, led by the Tusculan family, seized the opportunity and named Cardinal Bishop John of Velletri, a member of that family, as the next pope. He took the name Benedict X. The Reformed cardinals immediately countered by electing the Bishop of Florence, another German from Lorraine, as Pope Nicholas II. They could do so because they had astutely gained the protection of Pope Stephen IX's brother, Duke Godfrey of Lorraine and Tuscany, and his troops aided Nicholas in entering Rome. Benedict X fled and then resigned. It was questionable, however, whether a pope could resign. So despite Benedict's protestations that he had been forced to accept the papacy, never wanted in the first place, Hildebrand prosecuted him and had him formally deposed and imprisoned for the rest of his life. In my opinion, Nicholas II is a really underrated pope.
Wait a minute. You've got to admit that's not a promising start for any papacy. And I know it's been a long time since I studied this stuff, but I don't remember him playing much of a role in Gregorian Reform or the investiture controversy. What did he do?
Nicholas II as pope did 3 significant things. 1, he issued an election decree that placed the election of popes solely in the hands of the College of Cardinals. 2nd, he formally condemned the practice of lay investiture, which expanded the Gregorian Reform beyond simony and clerical unchastity. Finally, and this was his political masterstroke, he defanged the Normans by legitimizing their rule over southern Italy. He recognized Robert Guiscard, now the head of the hopeful family, as Duke of Apulia, and as a quid pro quo, Robert accepted the Pope as his feudal overlord.
This sounds like the King of France turning Vikings into the Dukes of Normandy.
Yeah, it's very much like that.
Okay. So, he was responsible for the College of Cardinals. Did that have any practical significance?
Immense. The papal election decree that he promulgated at the Lateran Synod of 1059 became how popes from that point on got elected. He ordered that popes were to be elected by cardinal bishops and then acclaimed by cardinal clerks, the remaining clergy, and finally by the people of Rome. If necessary, the election could be held outside of Rome, and a non-Roman cleric could be elected.
Wouldn't that become a problem when the King of Germany became an adult, since they claimed the ability to appoint popes?
Well, the decree acknowledges that the German king, as emperor, had a role in the selection of popes, and I'm going to quote this. Saving due honor and reverence for our beloved son Henry, who is at present king, and who, if God wills, is expected to be future emperor, insofar as we have made such concessions to himself and his successors, who shall personally have obtained this right from the Holy Apostolic See, end quote.
Boy, oh boy, is that vague. As a lawyer, if I were advising the Germans, I'd warn them. Okay, for starters, what does due honor and reverence entail? I mean, it could be just the courtesy of telling the emperor who they elected. And at most, Henry IV could expect that the cardinals would consult him before the election. And probably even more disturbing, this is a papal privilege conceded by Pope Nicholas II to King Henry IV, and as such would have to be renewed by future popes to future emperors. I mean, it sounds like it's saying the days of emperors appointing popes were over.
Yeah, I agree. Canon law demanded episcopal and abbatial elections by the clergy, and they demanded them to be free. But this had normally meant that the clergy was to acclaim freely a candidate appointed by the local prince in control of the diocese. The papacy had thus been alternately in the hands of the Roman nobles or the German king. The reformers changed this. By their definition, a free election meant that a bishop was to be elected by the clergy of his cathedral chapter, and the people's only function was to hear who had been elected and applaud the divinely inspired election. And this was to be true for the Bishop of Rome.
So the election decree was in effect the papacy's declaration of independence, which, I mean, it's not like that became the norm everywhere in Western Europe. I mean, otherwise...
Not yet.
Not for a long time.
Not yet. And I like the way that you put it. It is their declaration of independence.
Okay.
Nicholas II's decrees were directed not against the emperor, and that's important. They were directed against the Roman aristocracy. The emperor was a kid. Well, he's not even emperor. He's just a king, and he was just a child.
But again, you can issue all the decrees you want, but you don't have power. Nobody's going to listen to you.
We will get to that. Okay. The Pope's willingness to work with lay authorities is underscored by his alliance with both the Normans and especially with the Duke of Tuscany, his great protector.
But you said Nicholas II was the first pope to explicitly condemn lay investiture as an abuse, alongside simony and clerical unchastity. That had to be directed against emperors, kings, and dukes.
He was. And it was at this same council that he anathematized the practice of lay investiture. Pope Nicholas II was inspired to do this by, guess who? Humbert, because it was Humbert's pet issue.
Ah, yes, Humbert of Silva Candida, always a voice of conciliation.
Hey, I am the one who's supposed to be snarky. Okay, but your point is well taken. Temperance and tolerance were not among Humbert's virtues. Okay, and he didn't care about that. What is right, and it is right that the clergy belongs solely to God and the church, and that it was a great perversion for laymen to invest a bishop with the symbols of his spiritual office and his sacra potesta, his sacramental power. And it was as great a perversion as it was for them to sell these offices to ambitious clerics. At the time, the anathematization of the practice of lay investiture didn't seem to attract much attention, but this was the opening papal salvo of the investiture controversy. As long as the German king Henry IV was a child and his mother Agnes, as regent, feudally was trying to maintain royal control over insubordinate and ambitious German dukes, a papal election decree and prohibition on lay investiture was not matters of immediate concern. But once Henry IV came of age, things changed. And now we get to the heart of the story.
Wow. You know I love this stuff, but even I'm getting tired. How about we break off now? You gave medieval adultery 4. Let's give the papacy 5.
I was just getting started, Ellen.
That's what I was afraid of. We haven't even gotten to Pope Gregory VII and the investiture controversy. Let's tackle that fresh next time. Bye-bye for now.
Okay. Yes, dear. So until next time, bye for now.